great series, especially, the real skinny on fat. And this is what we should be talking about. And our next guest is a longtime friend of yours, but this is the real deal. Dr. Stephen Anton, right?
Yes, so I wanted everyone to have the opportunity to learn what I learned when I spent a lot of time with Dr. Anton. And what he showed me was that he and his team of researchers, over the course of several years, took the time to pull all of the diets that are out there and do what's called a systematic review. And in the systematic review, they look at the top 40 diets and they pinpoint the top 7. And then out of that top 7, they choose the very best diet. And so what Dr. Anton did was he, with me, looked at these actual studies around the top diet. And when we went deep down, we sort of went down the rabbit hole and looked at the individual participants. And look, some of these studies had thousands of people in them. When we looked at the individual participants, that's when we saw that the amount of different macronutrients that they were consuming had a direct impact on how much weight they lost and for how long they kept it off.
Wow. And you basically found out that those who consume the right level of fat did better losing weight.
Absolutely.
Wow. Absolutely incredible. Take a look at this.
Dr. Steve Anton, we're here at the University of Florida where you have been doing research for many, many years. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, what got you into the area of research that you really do on a daily basis and where your passion came from?
So my background is I was always passionate about health and wellness. I grew up as an athlete, so I was really interested initially in how do you enhance people's performance while they play sports. And that led to a natural exploration of factors that would affect how well I performed, such as sleep, exercise level, diet, nutrition, etc. So when I was in college, I wanted to explore the role of medicine, the role of psychology in performance. And of course, at that point, the field of health psychology, which is all about how lifestyle affects your wellness level, your well-being, was introduced to me. And I learned at that point that was really what I wanted to explore. And so I went on to get my PhD in a field called clinical and health psychology. From there, and while I was in graduate school, what we saw was this real increase in America in body weight, and the obesity epidemic was becoming truly an epidemic at that point. At this time, we all recognized that it was an epidemic, but 20 years ago, it was not at the level that it is currently. And so that sparked my interest in, well, what is driving obesity? What can we do to help people who have a propensity to gain weight in this environment? And so I went on to study at the Medical University of South Carolina, where I did what's called my internship and learned more about factors that would be contributing to unhealthy weight gain, and worked with some of the top experts in the world at that university. After that year was over, I moved to an institute called the Pennington Biomedical Research Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is really devoted specifically to trying to understand the factors that cause obesity, metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, and of course treatments for these conditions. At that institute, I really started to recognize this connection that is there between our dietary intake, our metabolism, our body weight, and our rate of aging. And so that was pretty fascinating to me. As I had the opportunity to become involved in one of the first randomized clinical trials looking at the effects of caloric restriction on what's called biomarkers of aging. And these are markers that have been shown in various longitudinal studies of primates to see which primates actually lived the longest and what are the markers that were associated with longevity. And so those same markers, low insulin levels, core body temperature, and DHEA levels were looked at in this study called the calorie trial. So while I was there, I really started to see this connection between, again, our calorie intake, our metabolism, and potentially the rate of aging and how that could be applied to humans. I also had the opportunity to participate in a study called the Pounds Lost clinical trial, which was a 2-year intervention looking at the effects of different macronutrient compositions on weight loss outcomes. And that, of course, was a strong interest of mine to this day. Eventually, the opportunity came to potentially join the Institute on Aging at the University of Florida, which is where I've been at for the past 10 years, and to oversee research looking at the role of lifestyle factors, nutritional compounds, and other potential interventions that are kind of what we consider cutting-edge interventions that may be effective in enhancing function as we age, both cognitive function, physical function, as well as, of course, helping reduce metabolic disease conditions that become so prevalent with aging. So I hope that helps give a background on me.
Yes, it's fantastic. And I've known you for many years, probably 9 years, 8 or 9 years. And during these years, I've had the privilege of watching some of the research that you've been doing. And I wanted to really take the time today to discuss this one study that you've done recently where it was a meta-analysis. And maybe you can, for the audience, just describe what a meta-analysis is and then give us a bit of an overview of this particular study.
Okay, and sure. A meta-analysis is where you essentially review studies in the literature and look at the magnitude of the effect across the studies and statistically determine what the kind of the mean effect is. And so how much on average does this particular type of intervention result in an effect, or what level of effect does this intervention have?
So I'm particularly interested in a systematic review that you've done, and if you can just give us a little overview of what a systematic review is as it relates to a study.
Sure. So a systematic review is where you essentially dive into the literature and look at articles that have been conducted on the topic of interest. And so in the case that I think you're referring to is the systematic review we published on the effects of popular diets on weight loss outcomes. And so what I had a particular interest in was, is there really a diet that's more effective or less effective than other diets in producing weight loss, and long-term weight loss in particular, because that's the number one challenge that most people have is maintaining weight losses once they've lost some weight.
So before we go further, how many popular diets were compared?
So for our review article, we started with the U.S. News and World Report list of popular diets in 2016, which had 38 diets listed.
Okay.
To start with.
And then you took all of those 38 diets and you compared them through different pieces of literature. So how many studies do you think you were comparing overall?
Sure. So what we did is, once we had our initial list of 38 diets, we then whittled it down to diets that did not include specific instructions to restrict calories or had specific foods provided as part of the diet. So that resulted in 20 total diets.
Okay.
And of those 20 diets, what we did is then looked in the literature using established search terms to see, well, what is the real effect of this diet independent of calorie restriction on changes in body weight. And so we started with that list of 20. And what we found is that of that list of 20, only 7 diets actually had clinical trials that were conducted in human participants for at least 6 months. And from there, we moved forward.
So there were 7 different diets that you focused on. There was the Atkins diet, there was the Ornish diet, there was the glycemic factor diet. Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, and so then we also looked at the Paleolithic diet,
Yeah.
the Mediterranean diet, the DASH
Zone
diet, and the zone diet
Yes.
as well. And so 7 came out as having at least one clinical trial conducted. And again, these were only of the 20, only 7 had at least a trial conducted.
Interesting.
So what that told us was that despite much of the claims out there, there's really limited evidence aside from these particular diets to support any claims.
And that's interesting too, because in a society where there's so much obesity, so much overweight, and yet we're constantly struggling for, what is the next best, newest thing, and yet you're saying that there are these 7 diets that are out there, out of all the diets, that have some substantiation to really support them, and that's over what, like 6 months, you were saying?
Well, for at least 6 months.
For at least.
Yes. And some of them had studies that were 1 year or longer, but not all of those 7 even.
So out of these 7 different diets, which one comes out on top?
It was really interesting, and it was pretty clear. Of all the diets that we looked at, the Atkins had by far the most scientific evidence to support it.
And what do you mean exactly by that?
Yeah. What we saw was in 9 of the 10 clinical trials that looked at the effects on short-term weight loss, that it was it produced clinically meaningful weight losses of 5% or greater in the participants. So that was fascinating. But what was even more fascinating was that in 6 out of 8 of the studies, long-term weight loss was at a very clinically significant level in this
in
diet.
the Atkins diet.
Yeah.
So with the Atkins diet, there are a tremendous number of studies that were done. And what you're saying is that the individuals that partook in these clinical studies, the Atkins studies, actually were achieving truly remarkable results.
Well, remarkable in the sense that here we have a diet that has actually shown to be able to produce clinically meaningful weight losses over the long term.
Wow.
And what that means is that these level of weight losses produced clinically meaningful changes in markers of cardiovascular health like blood pressure, blood cholesterol,
Wow.
blood glucose levels, and being able to maintain weight loss for at least 1 year or longer, as I mentioned earlier, is really one of the biggest challenges that we face in designing weight loss interventions. So it was pretty eye-opening to me when I saw what the literature had shown me, that indeed this particular diet, or studies that were conducted using this type of diet, were effective in producing weight loss, not just short-term weight loss, but long-term weight loss as well.
Within this research, when you go deep into these individual studies that really make up this body of work that Dr. Atkins' diet has, what do you see with the participants that lost the most weight or maintained the largest weight loss? What was their macronutrient profile?
Well, when we look at the individual studies,
Yes.
what you see is that there's a connection between the amount of dietary fat and the weight loss. And in particular, the studies in which the percentage of dietary fat was higher were associated with greater weight losses when we looked at the individual studies.
Oh, that's really interesting. So the Atkins diet came out on top of all the other diets out there. And then within these different studies that were conducted on the Atkins diet, what was found was that the individuals that consumed higher dietary fat actually had the most weight loss and for the longest period of time?
Sure, that when you looked at the weight losses in those individual studies, those were those studies in which the macronutrient composition was higher in dietary fat. You actually saw the higher weight losses or greater weight losses, and that held true for both the short-term and the long-term trials.
And so those individuals that were consuming higher dietary fat, they were consuming 50% or more of their caloric intake in fat?
Yeah, that was about the macronutrient composition. And the higher, when it was closer to 55 or 60%, I think was where we started to see even higher or better weight losses.
That's truly fascinating, because when we think about the Atkins diet, it's a focus more on like low carbs. But tell me how you see this information.
Yeah, it suggests that there's a connection between dietary fat intake and healthy fat intake and our body weight, and that maybe the focus should be a little less on low carb and maybe more on healthy fat. And it's not clear exactly what the perfect macronutrient composition is at this point in time, but the findings that we saw from looking at all these different clinical trials was that the dietary fat was not the driver of weight gain, but rather seemed to be associated with both short and long-term weight losses.
With both short and long-term weight losses, so this dietary fat. So you've been studying obesity, you've been doing clinical work with obese individuals for many, many years now, and you see this epidemic continuing to rise. We live in a society where it's about low fat and no fat still in today's climate. Is this what you're seeing with individuals that are obese? Are they consuming higher dietary fats or less dietary fats?
It's a good question. I think it varies, and I think that within the world of dietary fat, there's a lot of types of fats, and some may be unhealthy, such as trans fats. Some may be very healthy, such as polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats, and omega-3 fatty acids, for example. So the word dietary fat can mean a lot of different things, just as dietary carbohydrates can mean a lot of different things. And so I would say that it's not, unfortunately, that simple in terms of a perfect macronutrient or a perfect macronutrient ratio, but the type and quality of the foods within those macronutrients are very important. But what our findings do indicate, though, for sure, is that consuming high levels of dietary fat does not lead to long-term weight gain, but in fact may be associated or was associated with long-term weight losses. And so then we have to say, well, what types of fats are driving this? Yeah.
Where do you see many of your patients looking to achieve weight loss or maintain weight loss? Where do you see them focusing their attention? And have you seen a transition just overall, not even just with your patients, toward more fatty diets, ketogenics?
In overall, I've seen a lot more interest in this phenomenon of ketogenesis and what that means, and whether this diet related to ketones can actually produce better results. And so I think that's, you look in the internet and you see a lot of popular diets being talked about related to that. I think in terms of my patients, I think it varies on what level of information they've been exposed to. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what's getting you excited in the research that you're doing now, and maybe some of the newer research you've just conducted.
Sure. And I think it relates to what we were just talking about, that the role that potentially this phenomenon of ketones may have in our health and also in our body weight. And so some of the research I've been involved in more recently has been looking at the effects that this phenomenon called intermittent fasting may have in shifting your metabolism from using glucose for energy to using your own fatty acids, or converting your own fatty acids to ketones and using ketones as a source of energy, and what role that may have in fat loss as well as in muscle preservation. And so similar to the review that I mentioned earlier, we got excited by the idea of conducting a systematic review of the literature on the effects of intermittent fasting on changes in body composition to see what's actually known out there in human clinical trials.
Was there a lot of research on intermittent fasting out there that you were able to pull from?
I was able to identify a total of 14 clinical trials with this review. And I should tell you that there's different types of intermittent fasting, and the word intermittent fasting may mean different things to different people. The types of intermittent fasting regimens that we looked at were, the first was what's commonly called in the scientific literature time-restricted feeding, and that's where you fast for a discrete period of time, typically 14 to 16 hours, and then you eat for a specific period of time too, typically 8 to 10 hours. And so that's the first type. And in that type of intermittent fasting, we identified 4 human clinical trials. And the second type that we looked at was called alternate day fasting, or alternate day modified fasting. And in that approach, we identified 10 human clinical trials that looked at the effects of these types of regimens on changes in body composition.
And what were your findings?
Well, that was fascinating. So to just say it as it was, 13 out of 14 trials showed significant reductions in body fat, from intermittent fasting regimens. When you looked at the alternate day fasting regimens, all of them, 10 out of 10, showed significant reductions in body fat, with a few of them showing also reductions in lean tissue. Now, the ones in which there was a modified fasting, which was most of them, that means that the participants consumed somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 calories on the days that they were fasting. So on those days, there wasn't a true fast, but nevertheless, they all lost clinically meaningful amounts of body weight and body fat, with a small reduction in lean tissue. Conversely, in the time-restricted feeding that I mentioned earlier, where individuals would fast for 14 to 16 hours, followed by eating for a discrete period of time, usually about 8 to 10 hours, we saw no reduction in lean tissue in those studies, which suggests that the type of weight loss was predominantly body fat. So that is very encouraging. Now, it's also true that the amount of weight loss or the amount of fat loss was not as great on that type of regimen as it was on the alternate day fasting approach. So I think what we could conclude is that there's pros and cons to both approaches. One approach may result in a little bit greater retention of lean tissue. That's the time-restricted feeding approach, and the other approach may result in a little bit more fat loss, but potentially also a little bit of loss of lean tissue as well. So it may just depend on the person's goals.
But what is really exciting to hear is that both groups lost body fat and lost weight, and that one of the groups maintained all of the lean muscle mass and the other one just a small amount of lean muscle mass to lose.
Yes, and when you look at the amount of loss of lean tissue, it was relatively small. And one of the biggest challenges in traditional caloric restriction approaches to weight loss is that individuals lose approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of their weight in lean tissue. And this can have a detrimental effect on their metabolism, since lean tissue is a major driver of metabolic rate. And so over time, if the weight you're losing is comprised of both body fat and lean tissue, it can result in a reduction in metabolic rate and set people up for weight gain.
Fascinating.
So it's very important to maintain that lean tissue.
So with the time-restricted feeding, there was a little bit of muscle that was actually lost as well?
No, actually,
No.
with the time-restricted feeding, that was something that I found was remarkable, was that the lean tissue is not decreased. And if anything, in a couple studies, you see that it was increased, though it wasn't statistically significant.
Okay.
But it was not significantly decreased either, so it didn't change.
Remarkable. Can you give us an overview of what you sort of see as the type of fasting to focus on?
Well, I think it depends on the person's goals. It really does. That if their goal is to not lose any lean tissue and or maybe even gain lean tissue, that the time-restricted feeding approach I would recommend. And recognizing that they would likely lose some body fat, but maybe not as much as if they were to engage in the every other day or the alternate day modified fasting. If the number one goal is body fat loss, then I think they would be best served by trying to follow the alternate day modified fasting approach. And there does seem to be something beneficial about that small meal on the days in which they fast, at least from the standpoint of not reducing the lean tissue or to be able to maintain the lean tissue.
Really fascinating. Where do you think this research is going to be going over the next few years?
I think we're going to see a lot more exploration of the biology underlying the effects of intermittent fasting, and what I mentioned in briefly in the preclinical studies, where we see some effects at the cellular level in terms of reduced levels of inflammation, improvements in mitochondrial function, improvements in functional outcomes, both cognitive and physical. I think we're going to start to see a lot more research focused on that in humans. And likely, I would predict that we're going to support those findings that have been shown in preclinical trials in terms of improvements in cognitive function, physical function, changes at the mitochondrial and cellular level from following these lifestyles.
And so when you say changes at the cellular level, you're speaking about autophagy?
Potentially. Certainly, fasting is one of the best approaches in the preclinical studies to stimulate or activate autophagy and certain genes that have been associated with autophagy. And of course, by the process of autophagy and removing the damaged particles in the cells, you can produce healthier functioning cells and also healthier functioning mitochondria, which also relates to your overall metabolism. And yeah, so there's a connection there.
That's interesting. So the fasting with the activation of autophagy and then the mitochondrial function and metabolism, is
Yeah,
that sort of...
they're all connected, and I think where the research is going to go to explore this connection further, because with healthier mitochondria, your energy production, your systems for using energy are optimized, and so that would lead you to be able to use your calories more efficiently and produce lower levels of free radicals and reduce the demand on the body through this process.
What are a couple of the things that you're doing to improve your mitochondrial function?
All right, that's a good question. Well, I do practice intermittent fasting. I've been practicing that for the past year. So every day, almost every day, I don't eat until approximately 1 o'clock, sometimes at 12 o'clock, but usually it's a 16-hour fast. One of the things that I do that few people want to do is actually I go in a cold plunge many mornings where the water is very cold, and that can activate autophagy. It can also stimulate reduced levels of inflammation and lead to improved levels of circulation. Not saying this is for everybody, and this is certainly something that needs to be studied, but if you're asking me what I do,
absolutely,
those are some things. I also tried to utilize the sauna. I think the sauna has a lot of benefits. And of course, movement throughout the day is so important. We can, in our society, sit for too long, and that can lead to a host of problems. And so to the extent that I can move throughout the day, I do. And I try to really be conscious of that. In addition to having scheduled time for exercise, to actually make sure that I don't sit for too long of a period of time, like you alluded to. And people often ask me, well, what's the best exercise program? What's the best diet? And what I typically tell them is the one that you'll do. Because if people don't do it, it's not going to lead to a long-term sustainable success.
Excellent. Dr. Anton, this was a fascinating interview. I can't thank you enough for sharing the years and years and years of research that you bring to the table every day with passion and commitment to helping us understand our metabolic health and how we can really apply these incredible interventions.
Thank you for having me.
Really interesting. Dr. Anton, really kind of embraces everything that Dr. Atkins said.
It's true, and I loved going as deep as he went with this research.
Absolutely.